This reminder of a story that allows us to be upfront and personal with the divine psychology of where we're at when we no longer need to try. Remembering that every character in every story is an aspect of our self. It's a story about the fisherman who, after a day of being out on the ocean, was rowing his boat into shore when the rays of the sun glinted on what seemed to be golden light, and the form of a human body on a ledge on the rocky outcrop. So he quickly rowed his boat into shore and climbed the distance to the ledge, where he found a maiden, her golden hair cascading over the ledge and her body askew. He put his head down to her chest and found that she was still breathing. So he gathered up her slender body and carried it down to his boat, where he rowed back to the cove where his home was situated. Carrying the maiden into his house, he explained to his wife what he had found, and they very quickly went to tend to her wounds. But they ascertained that there was nothing broken, but she was still in an unconscious state. But after some while, the young maiden sat up and stated loudly, Where am I? Where is my baby? Where is my little boy?" And the fisherman and his wife were quite perplexed. But she was now lucid, and she explained to them, I enfolded my baby and I left him safe under a bush when I was looking for water, when I must have fallen. So the fisherman said, "Rest, we'll go and find your baby for you." But the fisherman, who gathered some of his neighbors and went off looking for the small boy, came back empty-handed. They'd scoured the area above the ledge and found nothing. The young maiden was inconsolable. I must find my small baby." But she was still quite impaired by her injuries, so the fisherman and his wife managed to convince her to stay at least until the morning, when she was more able to rise and to move on. In the morning, the young maiden was adamant that she must go, I must go and find my small baby. So, giving her the food and water, they let her leave, and she stated to them, I'll come back when I find my baby." So she went off, and going from place to place, she asked everyone, "Have you seen my child? Have you found my boy?" And no one had seen or heard of a lost infant. But as she wandered and was staggering through a forest area, she came across what was the encampment of a group of gypsies, and she sat at a distance from them until one of the small children in the group noticed her and told one of the elders, so they came over and invited her into their camp and gave her food and soup. She was fragile. So she told them her story. "I've lost my small baby, I'm searching for my baby. Can you help me? And they said, well, no, we're moving on to a new encampment, but we do know that our next encampment there's an old woman who's very wise. Perhaps she might be able to help you. So the young maiden followed the group of gypsies to the next encampment, and when the greetings were exchanged, she was led over to an old crone sitting on the steps of her caravan knitting, and they introduced the maiden to her, and the old woman looked at her and said, "My child, you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Sit, tell me what it is that troubles you." So the young maiden sat beside the old crone and told her story. "I'm looking for my child. I'm looking for my baby. I can't bear to have another loss in my life. My parents died when I was young, and I fed for myself until I met and married my husband, a wonderful man, a farmer, and we had our child, but he died. And now I cannot bear the thought of losing this. That is the only thing that is left for me." "Oh," said the old crone, "let me see what I can find." So taking a little sachet of what seemed to be sand out from under her skirt, she threw it on the fire, and smoke of different colors rose up. And the old woman said, I see. I see that your baby is safe, but he has been taken by the little people. He has been taken by the fairies to the underworld, because the fairies greatly, greatly love the human children. "Oh," said the maiden, "please, won't you help me to get my child? How can I get my child?" And the old woman said, "I know the ways of nature, but I do not know the ways of magic. But let me see." And so she left the maiden to rest, while sitting by the fire, the old crone sat throughout the night. And in the morning, when they woke, the old crone said to the maiden, "You know, it is known that the fairy people do not have creative ability. They can only take from life what they find, and they love precious things. They love beautiful things, but they have to take them from others because they only know magic. So go, find some treasures that you can give to the fairy people so that you can take back your child." What should I do?" said the maiden. The old crone said, "First of all, you must find something that will allow you to gain entry into their realm. And then you must find something that will allow you to take back your child." The maiden didn't know what she could do. But it was time for the gypsies to move on, and she was left to wonder, to ponder on what it was that she could find that would gain her entry into this fairy realm, and that which would redeem her child. So wandering in the forest as she did, suddenly she had the thought, and immediately she put it into action, drawing on her history, the culture, her heritage, the stories. And so immediately she went down to the beach, and she started to gather feathers, because she knew from her past that it had been told that one could create a wondrous cloak, a cape. So she went to the beach and she started to gather feathers that were tucked in amongst the little rocks and crevices. And the strange thing was, no wind blew the feathers away. It was quiet. And so, having gathered all the feathers together, she went to a quiet nook and she cut off her golden hair, and she began to weave the threads of her hair in amongst the feathers until she'd made a cloak that was so light and glistening that it almost floated of its own volition. And then, with the remainder of her locks, she went along the beach and found the bones, the skeleton of a sea creature. And so she formed these bones into a harp, threading it with the remaining locks of her hair, because she realized that music, the sounds, a harp, again from her past, from the stories. And so the harp was strung, and when she played the strings, even the birds of the air came down to listen. So taking the cloak and the harp, she went back and somehow was guided to a place where there were those circles, those circles where they say that the fairies gather. And she waited. And the old crone had given her a salve and said to her, "Rub this on your eyes and you'll be able to see things that you were not able to see before." So sitting quietly, holding her cape and the harp, she rubbed the cream on her eyes, and suddenly not only could she see, but she could hear. And she heard the tinkling of bells, and suddenly saw in the distance, coming out of the trees, a little troop, the fairy people. And as she watched, she saw an opening where there seemed to be no opening before. And she waited. And just as the last little being was entering the opening, she stepped out with her cloak. And this little being, being a little old fairy, turned to see her. "What are you, a human, doing here?" But then she caught sight of the cloak. I want that," said the fairy. "You can't have it unless you give me entry into your realm." Now the fairy was adamant and tried to grab the cloak from her, but she held it tight until, of course, the fairy could not resist seeing this so beautiful, glistening and gleaming in the moonlight, wanting to touch it, its lightness, that suddenly she allowed that entry into that opening. The maiden handed over the cape to the fairy, and quickly all the others gathered around, wanting to touch and feel, allowing the maiden to slip in and go down to the front of the gathering, where the head fairy was sitting enthroned. Now, when he saw that there was a human being in their midst, he was quite angry. "What is a human doing here in our midst?" But the maiden had her harp, and she quickly ran her fingers over the strings, and this wonderful sound, it completely enthralled the head of this fairy realm, who said, "I want that harp." But the maiden said, "No, you cannot have it unless you give back my child." But she played more. The sounds enthralled the whole throng of fairies. And so, reluctantly, because a human child was a prized gift, her baby was brought out and handed to her. Cradling him in her arms, she released the harp to the fairy, who immediately began to play a fairy tune, to which all the other fairies began to dance, of course, allowing the maiden to leave that realm, carrying her beloved child with her. The maiden returned to the fisherman and his wife, saying, "I said I would return when I found my small baby." And she stayed, and her son grew. The upfront and personal, related to the divine psychology of this story, is the question that's posed to each of us. What does this small child represent for us? What is it that we have to draw on all of our resources, all of our street smarts, our intuition and knowledge, to be able to claim, regain? What is this child for you? Is it your creativity? Is it some gift that there was a glimmering of long ago, quelled and kept down by the need to survive and shield and have weapons against? What is this child for you? And if anything, what is it that we must do to reclaim that child? As indicated by this story, everything we've ever known and experienced have to be brought to bear, to bring forth what it is that's necessary to reclaim this child, this gift, this force. What is this child for you?
It's like our inner self that is squashed and taken away, and we have to reclaim it by using all our powers, all we can do by ourselves.
You bet. You betcha. That requires attention, focus, awareness, vigilance in every single moment, not to forget, not to let it go. Isn't it so? This is why it said we have to know who we are and what we do. But if there's a vestige of loss or longing in us still, then we realize we've got a lost child. And we have to bring every element of that to bear. Our creativity, our intuitiveness, our relationship with life, all of it. To claim it, rest in it. What's your last child?